I think it was very much what China would have expected in terms of Putin not really giving up for peace anytime soon. I think what the whole world, including China, was probably waiting to see was how Trump would react to that. And it actually seems like Trump has reacted in, a very sympathetic way to Russia in terms of not saying that Putin is being recalcitrant in not accepting this 30-day truce. And so it's kind of a really good outcome for Moscow. And for China, there's often a feeling that the Russian invasion is a war on a different continent, that there's not much to do with China itself. And so they'll be watching from the sidelines and basically seeing Putin getting what he wants, and Trump being continuing to be an object of fascination and careful surveillance, but not not directly impacting China just yet. This is something that the Trump camps have been saying, doing something of a reverse version of the what Kissinger and Nixon did in the 1970s with the rapprochement with China, that then they think peeled China away from the USSR at the time, and they wonder if they can do the same, but with peeling Russia away from China now. The circumstances are different. Russia doesn't really seem to be tempted by what America has to offer. First of all, there's the idea of geopolitical calculus in the world. If Russia has to be aligning with anyone, it seems like it should be the rising second economy rather than the biggest economy, which seems to be kind of in a lot of different ways, having its own problems. And so Putin wants to do that. Secondly, when it comes to raw economic links between Russia and China, they have only deepened in the last few years, especially since the Russian invasion. I think since the sanctions have come in on Russia, Russia has relied much, much more on Chinese technology, on Chinese computing, on Chinese, and the Chinese, they rely on Russian oil. And I think I saw somewhere that actually for Russian consumers, most of the imported goods that they get, for example, automobiles, are actually now from China, whereas before they used to be from the EU. So what we see is Russia separating from the West and leaning towards China much more, and Putin and Xi keeping very close communications. So I think this idea that the US can peel Russia away from China, it's easier said than done. I think it definitely helps China that the world's attention is focused on Ukraine. That for once, China doesn't feel like it is the biggest enemy of the West. And we see this in the sense of like the EU is kind of thinking about sanctions on Russia and what's going on with Ukraine rather than actions in Taiwan. I think that's definitely true. At the same time, whether or not China uses this chance to do something on Taiwan drastic, I think that's still open for discussion because what we've seen is actually it's 3 years since the invasion has started. The situation in Taiwan hasn't been impacted by the invasion so much as it has been impacted by American actions. For example, Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan 2 summers ago, and so that's the kind of thing that China thinks much more about. It sees Taiwan as a much more intimate and China relevant topic, and that's not going to be swayed by what happens in the world. There are a lot of different other calculuses that go on when it comes to what China wants to do with Taiwan. For example, whether or not it can invade Taiwan quickly if it does want to do that. And that's the kind of thing that China will be thinking about rather than just the Ukraine situation. So the 2027 deadline, I think it's really important to say that it mainly comes from the US security apparatus. They believe that 2027 is an internal deadline that Xi Jinping has told the PLA. And actually, when you trace back to where that comes from, is actually a deadline that Xi Jinping has set for the what he calls the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. Now, what that actually means, these American generals have interpreted to mean an invasion of Taiwan. But it's important to set out that the Chinese side has never said that. So it is an interpretation that the American generals have made that rejuvenation of Chinese nation, Taiwan is the last piece, therefore invasion by 2027. But we don't have any explicit linking of those things from the Chinese side. So I am actually quite skeptical that it will happen by 2027, that there is such a deadline as this. Politicians don't like to tie their own hands, and Chinese politicians are no different on that front. Nobody knows what the world will look like in 2 years' time. And I think it would not be good for China's perspective to kind of set a deadline on that. And so I think I would just kind of almost question that deadline in and of itself. So I think there are different things we could look at. For example, on the coastal regions of China, has there been a buildup of various different facilities that might be used for war? For example, hospitals, or resources being moved there, or troops being moved there. You know, those are all things to look at. Something else is the idea of the PLA gearing itself up for more what we call joint operations. So that is the combination of land, sea, and air, which is what is needed for a military force to take Taiwan because it will be an amphibious landing. It's not like invading Ukraine, you just march across land. That gives it a certain higher level of difficulty, one that some commentators say that China is not there yet with its PLA. And we it's very hard for us to know on the outside how far along it has managed to achieve that. But what we can say is that in the last couple of years, Xi has been targeting PLA corruption at a very high level. Rocket generals have disappeared. Even very senior officials on the Central Military Commission, which is basically the organizations that control the military, have been sanctioned, investigated for corruption. What does that tell us? Is that a sign of Xi putting more scrutiny on the PLA and getting it ready for war footing? Or is that a sign that the PLA is so far from a war footing that these senior officials are still being ousted like this? As ever with Chinese topics, it's very hard to look at from the outside because the CCP deliberately makes the system such a black box and doesn't want people to know. But you know, so we on the outside can only we're reduced to reading tea leaves. But that's so actions within the PLA is something else that I would look at before an invasion of Taiwan as well. Across the Taiwan Strait, a significant proportion of the world's trade flows through those naval maritime routes. We have some of the world's largest economies dependent on the stability of the region, not just China, but also Japan, South Korea, as well as Russia and Asian nations as well. So it could really be a trigger for a third world war if that really does happen. And I think, you know, if you think about Ukraine and Russia being very big nations, but actually, in a grand scale of things, the Russian economy is about the size of a Chinese province. I think China has not had much practice in being a diplomatic power broker so far. It doesn't really tend to do that, you know, in the way that America goes out and leads negotiations between different countries. China just doesn't really bother with that kind of stuff. It has a very kind of pragmatic view on these things as well. What's in it for me? If there's nothing obvious in it for me, why should I expend energy on it? So, to the extent that the Ukraine-Russian invasion war is happening, China a couple of years ago did put forward a peace proposal, but that was roundly criticized by Europeans as basically being one-sided towards Russia, because what it said was that the ceasefire should happen along the lines of the war at the time, which, you know, would have seen Russia having taken large parts of the territory of Ukraine already anyway. Now, of course, we're under this situation now where the American administration is saying that that's what the ceasefire looks like anyway. So I think it feels like to China there's not much that they can do on that front. There's not much that they need to do on that front. So going back to initially our first answer, which is just that China's sitting back and seeing how can I make the most out of this situation now with expending the least possible resources.
China will never take Taiwan by force.
I never comment on that. I don't comment on anything because I don't want to ever put myself in that position. And if I said it, I certainly wouldn't be saying it to you. I'd be saying it to other people.
Trump's whole idea of international relations, as you know, is very pragmatic. He thinks that America should be out to be America first and to be America only. And so, is there any interest in America defending Taiwan? He sees it similarly to Ukraine, I think. You know, what is it what is in it for America to defend these countries from foreign aggressors? He doesn't understand the kind of the value of international alliances by themselves. So he has previously already said in the past that they should see themselves as an insurance company, that America should see itself as an insurance company for Taiwan. If Taiwan makes it worth their while, they will defend it. If not, then they won't. And so that is a real big question now at the moment, how far a Trump presidency would go to invade to defend Taiwan if an invasion happens. But, you know, as I say, I'm skeptical that an invasion will happen in this presidential term in any case.